But inside the church, this dynamic is working heavily as well. It can be seen in whole congregations motivated almost completely by fear and guilt and a need for approval. So we have to be careful. What's he saying we have to be careful about? Self-righteousness. Thinking that we're more deserving of grace and salvation because of how we live our lives versus someone else. And that's not the gospel. All right, verse 11 through 16, where Paul is talking about this being grafted in and why did Israel stumble, okay? Why did Israel stumble? Why did they trespass? Israel trespassed, but it brought salvation to the Gentiles. There was a lot of hostility to Christianity among the majority, again, of Israel. And if this had not happened, the early Jewish Christians could have easily concluded that the gospel was only for ethnic Israel. So what he's kind of asking us to think about there is, okay, think about this. You know, in Acts, you had this repeated cycle of the gospel's preached in the synagogue, right? You see it over and over again. The Jewish community is fractured, rejects the gospel. As a result, the apostles go out to the Gentiles. Gentiles are saved, and the church becomes multi-ethnic, Jew and Gentile. But what if that wasn't the case? What if the Jewish nation wholly adopted Christianity and the idea of grace? What the idea is, it's possible that salvation never even goes to the Gentiles, that it's maintained within the ethnic Israel as just for them, only for them. They're the chosen people for no one else. Keller says, without Israel's rejection as a whole of the gospel, Christianity could have stayed locked in as only a renewal movement inside ethnic Israel, and their transgression would not have meant what Paul says, riches for the world. So they transgress, they reject God. God says, okay, I'm going to make, you've worshipped idols, you've made me jealous. I'm going to make you jealous by going out and giving the gospel of grace to these Gentiles. And that's what happened. And here we are. A question that's posed is, can this whole, Paul mentions jealousy twice. That I share this gospel with the Gentiles and make the Jews jealous. That kind of seems odd when you read it, right? Like, why would you intentionally try to make somebody jealous? That seems like a bad thing. So can it be a good thing? And John Stott says this: not all envy is tainted with selfishness, because it is not always either a grudging discontent or a sinful covetousness. At base, envy is the desire to have for oneself something possessed by another, and whether envy is good or evil depends on the nature of the something desired and on whether one has any right to its possession. If that something is in itself evil, or it belongs to somebody else who have no right to it, then it's sinful. But if the something desired is in itself good, a blessing from God, which he means all his people enjoy, then to covet it and envy it is not unworthy. The kind of desire is right in itself and aroused to be a realistic motive. Keller says, just as the Gentiles could have only have heard because Israel rejected Christ in great part, now the Jews, as we move forward, can only believe because the Gentiles have accepted Christ in great part. In other words, the Jews will see fulfilled in the Gentiles so many of the promises of the Old Testament. He gives some examples of that, like, for instance, the priests that are supposed to be, the head of the Jewish nation. Well, that's no longer the case. There's so many promises fulfilled in the Gentiles that were meant for the Jews, and so this one thought is it's to make them jealous, and that can be a good thing. But there's also, don't forget that Paul, when he's talking about this, he's likely referencing Deuteronomy 32:21, which is where Moses is in prophecy from God saying this. This is a quote from Moses. It's a song. It's a song. They have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. And then Paul, you notice how he said that he's trying to make them jealous so that he can try to save, and he says, some of them. But so why? Why only some of them? And just a preface, we're going to get there. Only some of them could Paul save then, or could we save now, though we should still try, because all Israel will not be saved until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. That's what the scripture says in verse 25 to 27. Has that happened yet? That hasn't happened yet. Importantly, though, Gentiles, we have not taken Israel's place. Their rejection is not total. It's not final. Instead, Gentiles, we're grafted in, as Paul says, to the branches that are God's people who grow from the nourishing root. Before we go further, who's the nourishing root? Who's the root? What's the root of Israel? It's Abraham, right? We're going to talk about that in a minute. God isn't finished with them because the root, the lump, as Paul says, is holy. Israel's root and first lump of dough is Abraham, to whom God made many covenant promises. And that covenant has been enacted but not completed. John Piper says, Abraham's salvation was, as it were, a pledge or a guarantee of great things still to come. The salvation of the whole lump, the restoration of the branches that were temporarily broken off. Y'all know what I mean when I say the whole lump, right? And the root. It's where Paul's talking about here. He says, if the dough offered its first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. And he says, for if their rejection means, this is verse 15, if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? So then you start talking about these trees, right? Paul loves to use these, to invoke these horticultural examples of Scripture. And, what's another one we've talked about in this class where Paul used horticulture as to talk about Scripture? Think about one other we've talked about together, what Paul wrote. Fruit of the Spirit, right? The fruit of the Spirit, where Paul talks about it being growing out and the different ways that it grows. Well, here's a wild olive tree in Israel and some cultivated olive trees in Napa. Just so we've gone through a lot of Scripture now, I thought I'd show you a picture. So there's a wild olive tree in Israel. There's some cultivated olive trees in Napa Valley. Paul talks about the Jews being the cultivated olive tree, okay? The Gentiles, he talks about being these wild olive shoots grafted into the cultivated tree, the root of which is the Abrahamic promise. And here's a quote from William Ramsey. In exceptional circumstances, it is customary, this is a horticulture point, it is customary to reinvigorate an olive tree which is ceasing to bear fruit by grafting it in with a shoot of the wild olive, so that the sap of the tree ennobles this wild shoot, but the tree again begins to bear fruit. Keller says, the wild olive branch, which is us, by the way, the Gentiles, is a dynamic growing thing, but it is only able to draw life and produce because it is grafted in to the cultivated tree from which it draws nourishment. Okay, you cut off the wild olive branch, it would have been growing, but now it would be dead. You graft it into the cultivated tree, and then but on the other hand, the presence of that wild branch now grafted into the new tree renews the whole tree, kicking on all its systems. And sort of the thought there is, wild olive tree produces many different types of olives, polytheistic. The Jews were the cultivated, pruned olive tree. Again, you've got this concept of completed Jews. You got this now, you bring in this wild olive branch, and you graft it in, and it flourishes and makes a completed Jew eventually versus this converted Gentile. We're converted from the wild olive tree to the cultivated olive tree. The basis of our faith is the Abrahamic promise. But the main point of verses 17 to 24 seems to really be about us Gentiles being thankful and not arrogant and understanding our blessing and not being anti-Semitic, really. We must realize that we are the beneficiaries of the biblical religion of Israel, grafted into the tree of Israel. We inherit the promises given to Abraham because we have faith. We can't look down on the Jews. We should respect them. Again, as Paul says, you don't support the root, but the root supports you. And remember, after all, we've got a Jewish Messiah and a Jewish Bible. Out of 66 books in the Bible, only 2 were written by Gentiles. Which 2? Which 2? Which 2 of the books? Just fun trivia. 66 books of our Bible written by Jews, 2 by Gentiles. Which 2?
Luke.
And Acts. The good doctor. Right? Luke and Acts are the only 2 books of the whole Bible not written by a Jew. Our Messiah was a Jew. Okay, so the point is that while we have been given this grace, and we have been given this opportunity to accept Christ, we should not look down on Israel because God is not done with Israel. I should say, when I said Jesus was a Jew, born into a Jewish family, rather. Let us Gentile believers humble ourselves and be grateful for the kindness of God, compassionate toward our Jewish neighbors who have temporarily fallen. So then you come to this mystery then. I know we're going fast, but And then you come to this mystery where Paul says, he goes through the branch, comparison and how God's not done with Israel. And then he says in verse 25, lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. And then he goes on, he quotes Isaiah and Jeremiah to reveal that mystery, that all Israel will be saved once the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Okay, so who is all Israel? Who is that? Well, it's not just the elect remnant. It's not just the ones that it's not just Jews for Jesus, or it's not just the elect remnant who have accepted Christ, but it's ethnic Israel as a whole. Although all Israel does not mean every Jew without exception, it's instead a recurring expression in Jewish literature referring to Israel as a whole, the great mass of Jewish people. So what does it mean when Paul says saved, that all Israel is going to be saved? Well, the quote that immediately follows from Isaiah and Jeremiah says that a deliverer will come from Zion, who will take away their sins. This is clearly Jesus. Paul is saying that Israel as an ethnic people will experience salvation through Jesus Christ. That's pretty phenomenal. I know we're going through this fast and it's a lot to take in, but think about what we just said. This group of people who has completely and totally rejected Jesus Christ as their Messiah, and who essentially, when they hear us preach the gospel, take it as heresy, they will be saved. Now, does that mean every single Jew will be saved? No, but as on a whole, the majority of Jews will be saved through Jesus Christ. So what's Paul doing there? He's really strongly encouraging us to continue to evangelize to Jews. Although, again, they don't agree today that Jesus is the Messiah, and that's why Paul says, from the standpoint of the gospel, you're right, they're your enemies right now. But as to election, they have a covenant still with God through Abraham. And so, again, we know in God's sovereignty, He can do that. He can show mercy to them. I thought this was a good quote about how to sort of frame up the fact that we still should evangelize the Jews, and how that really squares with not being anti-Semitic. It is understandable that since the Holocaust, Jews have demanded an end to Christian missionary activity among them, and that many Christians have felt embarrassed about continuing it. It is even mooted that Jewish evangelism is an unacceptable form of anti-Semitism. So some Christians have attempted to develop this two-covenant theology, where there are two different salvation tracks: the Christian track for the believing remnant and believing Gentiles, and then this other track for historical Israel that relies on God's covenant with them to say that they're saved. Romans 11, John Stott says, stands in clear opposition to this trend because of its insistence on the fact that there's only one olive tree to which Jewish and Gentile believers both belong. Jewish people will be grafted in again if they do not persist in unbelief. We are to be afraid that unbelief has done to some of them. So faith in Jesus is essential for them. The two-covenant theology has disastrous effect on perpetuating the distinction between Jews and Gentiles, which Jesus Christ abolished. The irony of this is that the late 20th century, in an effort to avoid anti-Semitism, has advocated a position which Paul, the non-evangelization of Jews, by the way, which Paul regards precisely as anti-Semitic. To not evangelize the Jews, Paul says, is anti-Semitic. It would be quite intolerable to imagine a church at any period which was either simply a Gentile phenomenon or consisted only of Jews. So when will this happen? You know, the question that's very interesting when you talk about these different time frames, and the fact that right now we're experiencing this time of grace and mercy to the Gentiles that will ultimately end, and will come a period of time when God shows grace and mercy to the Jewish people. So when will that happen? Well, there are many eschatological views. I can't say that word today. The passage says this: it'll happen when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, and the deliverer comes from Zion. Zechariah 12, if you read that, says it'll happen when Jerusalem's enemies are destroyed. Keller says many people, and I put like Piper, John Piper, think this must mean a last-minute, large-scale mass revival of Christianity among Jews. And that could be the case. But Paul's language allows for the possibility of a steady but growing flow of Jews into Christianity until we arrive at the place that more or most Jews have come to believe. But look at Matthew 24:14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. The view is that the latter-day conversion of ethnic Israel at large is a great sign that the judgment of the kingdom are at hand. And then look at Matthew 19:28. Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, in the new world," and in the new world, rather, is a phrase that in Greek means in the regeneration. "When the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." The view is that Israel's regeneration will come when Christ returns to sit over the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So, we don't know exactly when it will come. It'll come when God deems the fullness of the Gentiles to have come in and that He's ready to return. And at some point in that time frame, and I don't know, I would love to hear Leslie's thoughts on it because I know she's studied this a lot. At some point there, when Jesus returns, all Israel will be saved, or will have progressed to the point of being saved. So regardless though of the fact, I think it's very appropriate that Paul ends Romans 11 after all that with worship. He spontaneously breaks into worship. And the point really is, though we don't have the final answer, true theology ends with praise. And it's okay. God is very clear in the scripture about what's going to happen and what to look for, but He just doesn't tell us when, and that's okay. And I love how Paul uses, he quotes there Isaiah 40 and Job 41 when he praises God. So he goes through this big long theological exposition on what, that the Jews are not done for. And then he just breaks into praise. And he says, "Oh, the depths of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are His judgments and how inscrutable His ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Who has been His counselor? Or who has given a gift to Him that He might be repaid? For from Him and through Him and to Him are all things. To Him be all glory forever." Amen. So, some people can't believe in God because they don't fully understand everything. We, like Paul, should not be troubled by the parts of God's ways that we cannot discern. And with that, we have finished the doctrinal section of Romans. We've finished going through these ideas of condemnation, justification, sanctification, and vindication of God in mystery, chapters 1 through 11. Those are the doctrinal sections. And now we get to go into what I call the fun part, which is, the practical section, chapter 12 through 16. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of how you live, how to treat and view others? Romans 12, Bill gets to teach on next week, is one of my favorite chapters in the entire Bible. It's going to be awesome, but Romans 12:10 says, "Be devoted to one another in love and honor one another above yourselves." So next week we'll go into chapter 12 and keep moving forward through the practical section, but that's Romans 11. Again, I know that was fast, and I know that was there's a lot of stuff there. Has anybody got any questions or thoughts or open discussion to have on Romans 11? Any ideas or again questions about what Paul meant or what this really even means?
I think it's just amazing to see God's plan for all of His people and just the love that He has for everyone and the story that He's written so that Gentiles and Jews could be saved. It was all part of His plan for the Jews to reject Him so that we would get an opportunity to believe. And it's neat to see how He plans to bring the Israelites back. And I love how it ends with the doxology of just praise, because who can really fathom His plan? But He gives us so many pieces that we can study to just know that He's full of goodness.
Yeah. Anybody got any other thoughts? Any eschatological views, Dr. Asher?
I'll ask my wife.
Yeah.
Well, I love how it goes, we talked about chapter 9 and how that's, with the tulip was founded on and all that, and they put their leg and they stand on that, and how the Lord speaking through Paul, it's almost as if, Paul is just writing down what the Lord's telling him, and he gets to chapter 11, and of course the Lord knows what people would have done with the words in 9 and 10, and he ends with 11, and then Paul ending with the praise, like, he's like you say, boom,
Yeah.
Because he answers chapter 9 with this end that you can't stop,
Yeah.
evangelizing.
Yeah, it would be easy after chapter 10 to write off the Jewish people.
Right.
Just write them off and be done with them. Take a Mel Gibson approach. Be completely anti-Semitic. But clearly that is not biblical. Clearly that is not the gospel. It's not scripture. God has a plan for Israel, His chosen people, and I agree, Jen. I'm thankful I guess, for the opportunity that we had to accept Christ. But I find it very interesting also that God has this other plan, this other time ahead where His people that have completely and totally rejected Him as the Messiah will turn back. Any other thoughts? Questions about the olive trees? Being grafted in or anything like that? I thought it was all very interesting. Good chapter, and also again, today's the Sunday where we're talking about the vision for our church. So I thought it's pretty neat that we had this fall today where we're talking about the past and the history and what God's people went through, and then what God has in store for them. Again, you kind of can't know where you're going till you know where you've been, and I'm excited about the future of our church. So, Russell, will you close us in prayer?
I will. Lord, we're thankful for this Sunday morning. Thankful for chapter 11 of Romans and this remarkable part of the story and the opportunity to be grafted in to receive salvation, Lord. It really is astounding. God, just be with the number of prayer requests that we should do this morning as well. And be with us as we proceed to corporate worship. In Christ's name.